Well, good morning, everyone. Happy day 3 of conference. I see that it is 9 a.m. here in California. And because of the wonders of technology, we have two very special guests joining us from South Africa today. So welcome to session number 90, our Sunday keynote entitled Confronting and Addressing Systemic Racism, Living Occupational Therapy Through Ubuntu. My name is Bryant Edwards, and I'm the OTAC president. And I do want to share a few housekeeping items before we start today's presentation. We have all of our participants on mute, and we'll be utilizing the question and answer features during this webinar to facilitate any questions you might have. And we'll be doing that at the conclusion of the pre-recorded session. So you can enter your questions at any time, but we'll be answering them at the end. The Q&A feature is at the bottom of your webinar screen, so toward the bottom right. And we do have our presenters who will be with us to answer those questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording on Socio, the platform we're using, within the next week or so, and we'll have access for 60 days following the conference. Finally, following this session, there will be a link for the session evaluation that we'll place in the chat window. So make sure that you complete that survey in order to receive your certificate of completion, and you'll receive an email from FlexiQuiz that will contain your certificate. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our two Sunday keynote speakers. Dr. Frank Kronenberg is an international guest lecturer and chair of the board of directors for Grandmothers Against Poverty and AIDS in Cape Town, South Africa. And Dr. Elewani Ramugondo is deputy dean of postgraduate education and professor and faculty of health sciences at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So with that, we will start this morning's presentation.
Warm greetings from South Africa, colleagues and friends. While Frank and I would have much preferred to connect and engage with you in real time in California, we are now doing so virtually from our home in Cape Town. It's an honor for Frank and I to be speaking at this first ever virtual 2020 OTAC conference. Yes, I am the same Erewani as on the conference poster, this time just without dreadlocks. And there's nothing much to my now shaven head, except that this is what I do every end of a decade. A new chapter embodiment. Frank's and my deep appreciation for being invited to give this keynote address goes to OTAC's terrific conference committee, President Bryant Edwards, and co-chairs Julie Kugel and Winifred Schultz-Kron. Our gratitude also goes to all the delegates. It's not often that we share a platform to speak, Frank and I, as a couple. In fact, the last time we gave a talk together was in 2010 at the World Federation of Occupational Therapy Congress in Santiago de Chile. So today, from our home country, South Africa, let's Zoom.
Today's keynote builds on 3 preceding talks that at least some of you have attended, respectively OTAC's 2017 Centennial Keynote in Sacramento, which focused on humanizing praxis, occupational therapies from the South, followed by Ilelwani's inaugural address at the WFOT 218 World Congress in Cape Town, which addressed the topic Healing Work, Intersections for Decoloniality. Mind you, this was the first such gathering on African soil during the first year of the next century of OT, delivered by the first ever black female WFOT keynote speaker in its 66 years history. And the third talk was back in March this year at what appears to have been the last major real-time OT conference of 2020, the Western Regional OT Spring Symposium in Las Vegas, during which Dr. Michael Iwama and I had jointly addressed the topic Occupational Therapy in the Age of Disruption. In retrospect, a theme with a prophetic ring that had been suggested by OTAC Executive Director Karen Polastri.
Now that Frank has given a sequence of previous talks and platforms where some of you engaged with our work, I will now give a synopsis of our presentation today. In the introduction, we will situate both ourselves as speakers and the topic itself. The main contents of our talk are framed by 3 questions and corresponding conceptual lenses, respectively. The why and occupational apartheid address systemic racism in relation to a historicized and politicized main concern and purpose of 20th century OT. The how and occupational consciousness attend to what we are now challenged to do differently as OTs. And the what shares some real case examples of how collective occupations can be a powerful vehicle through which to institutionally and structurally address issues of systemic racism. Lastly, the wrap-up section attempts to recapture the main points of our talk before offering a closing thought and inviting questions, comments, and discussion. So, situating ourselves, I will start. I was raised both in rural South Africa as well as a township. Townships are apartheid-style suburbs reserved only for black people before 1994. These townships served as reservations for access to cheap labor when the main cities such as Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban were founded and built. OT found me as a rural schoolgirl in a place known as Venda. Having been encouraged throughout high school to study medicine or engineering, choosing OT was both a form of rebellion and a calling. At that time, during my second last grade before finishing school, I had the role of being a library assistant. Because of a track record of high school assessment marks that were high, I was saved from scrubbing classroom floors, cleaning toilets, or sweeping school grounds like other school children. One day, as I was neatly filing books back to the bookshelves, a pamphlet fell out of a career book. The pamphlet was on OT in mental health. I was drawn to this, having recognized that mental illness was a symptom of a society in distress. Without yet having read on how OT was founded, namely on the basis of massive human displacement and social crisis that followed, somehow I was already attuned to the social practice of OT, without losing sight of the need to attend to individuals in distress who end up with a medical diagnosis. I'm saying all this so that you can appreciate the fact that the mini bio sketch you now see on the slide presenting Ilelwani which in my mother tongue, Chivenda, means remember with hindsight. Erelwani, spouse to Frank, also an OT. Erelwani, mother of two, Masana and Isha. Erelwani, who is currently Deputy Dean for Postgraduate Education at the Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Cape Town, became an OT a long time ago. And that she continues to be an OT whose main interest is how we are doing as a society wherever we find ourselves. It is no accident, therefore, that my work has led me to conceptualizing two terms, occupational consciousness, and with Frank, collective occupations. That my PhD, a study on intergenerational play, led to a political awakening, and that decoloniality of doing for healing work became so urgent.
I choose to very briefly situate myself, not by speaking to the bullet points on the slide which you can read, but by sharing how I got my African name, followed by literally embodying what it means. And you must know that in an African cultural context, the meaning of the name you were given may constitute your life's purpose. So back in 2007, after my first 2-3 years of living and working in Cape Town, South Africa, I was given an isiXhosa name, Nyaniso, which translates into the one who speaks his true mind from the heart. I have since become increasingly aware of and sensitive to the deeply violent role that my Dutch and European ancestors have played in the founding and subsequent evolution of both my new home country, South Africa, and the country that inspired me to becoming an OT, the United States. Today, some 25 years after the fall of the apartheid regime, most probably the best known explicit systemic racism case example in human history, contemporary South Africa continues to embody a profoundly dehumanizing, violent, divided and wounded societal condition. And living up to the meaning of Nyaniso, I reckon that systemic racism in the USA is arguably more comparable to pre- and post-1994 apartheid South Africa than we are likely prepared to admit. In situating the topic, the second part of the introsection of this talk, we want to highlight the historical moment that prompted systemic racism to become the focus of this keynote. While the murder of George Floyd constituted a tipping point, it was the unprecedented Black Lives Matter-led global outrage against racially motivated police brutality, the original reason for which BLM had been established in July 2013, that likely urged a number of OT associations and platforms to issue public position statements, interestingly employing very different keywords. Also, throughout June and July, AOTA had hosted 4 Be Heard, We Are Listening sessions, intended, citing AOTA verbatim, to provide Black occupational therapy colleagues and students with an opportunity to share their thoughts on recent events and have highlighted acts of injustice nationally. The board of editors of the Journal of Occupational Science has since published a pledge to mobilize against racism, along with a special virtual issue on anti-racism. And lastly, at this conference, no less than 11 papers, more or less explicitly, addressed the topic of systemic racism. It is critical to acknowledge the importance of what we are doing this year. For the first time in our profession's 103 years history, breaking the loud silence on an issue that harmfully occupies our global local societies for centuries. Above and beyond the far-reaching impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the year 2020 pushes us to commit to identifying, interrogating, and effectively addressing the skeletons of neglect and denial of systemic racism in our institutional closet. The work we must do individually and collectively is deeply challenging and inescapably disruptive. And to allow for authentic grappling with this complex issue requires that we exercise deep humility and brutal honesty with ourselves and each other.
We now proceed with the main contents of the talk. Frank will start with addressing the why question and occupational apartheid in terms of the relevance of systemic racism to the main concern and purpose of occupational therapy.
Okay. To allow for meaningful engagement with the topic, let us clarify upfront how we understand racism and occupational apartheid in this talk. Our preferred definition of racism, informed by the collective work of authors such as Wallenstein, Fanon, Sosa Santos, was articulated by the Puerto Rican UC Berkeley-based sociologist Ramon Grossvogel. Racism is a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human that has been politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries by the institutions of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. Racism can be marked by color, extending into ethnicity, language, culture, and/or religion. Considering that in the public discourse, racism tends to be reduced to being about everyday expressions of interpersonal bias and prejudice, we find Grossvogel's definition helpful for 4 specific reasons. 1, it politicizes by foregrounding unequal power relations involving a dehumanization dynamic. 2, it historicizes by recognizing racism's long-term historical origins and evolution. 3, it emphasizes its systemic nature. And 4, it includes and importantly pushes beyond the marker of pigmentation. It seems appropriate and helpful to juxtapose this framing of racism with the most up-to-date definition of the occupational science and occupational therapy concept, occupational apartheid, which arguably resonates most explicitly with systemic racism. Occupational apartheid refers to systematically enacted negations of humanity to divide and subjugate collectives of people to the benefit of some at the expense of others. This is done through oftentimes intersecting oppressive social mechanisms, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, neoliberal individualism, masterminding unequal access to resources that can sustain dignified living for all. So why are systemic racism and occupational apartheid relevant to occupational therapy? We approach responding to this question by politicizing and historicizing the main concern and ultimate purpose of our profession. To clarify, drawing from Aristotle's interpretation of what being political is about, by politicizing we mean becoming concerned with what is good and bad for society as a whole. And by historicizing, we mean reviewing the evolving visions of our profession in the context of the United States. Back in 1917, the founders of the National Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy framed the main concern and purpose in terms of advancing occupation as a therapeutic measure. Mary Riley, in her landmark 1961 Eleanor Clark Slagle lecture, captured this in the phrase, satisfying society's vital needs through occupation. The AOTA 217 Centennial Vision, meeting society's occupational needs. And its current vision, 2025, spells out maximizing health, well-being and quality of life for all people, populations, and communities through effective solutions that facilitate participation in everyday living. Key words across these statements are occupation and society and/or all people, populations, and communities. However, an honest, critical appraisal of the extent to which our profession embodies its main concern and purpose reveals that we mostly offer exclusive services to those who can afford these, and that we are mainly concerned with addressing how some people, clients, are doing, functioning, as individuals in their everyday social contexts. For argument's sake, we refer to and frame this dominant, basically apolitical practice as 20th century occupational therapy. And to allow us to envision confronting and addressing systemic racism, we propose to reframe our profession's main concern and purpose politically as how are we doing, functioning, together on an everyday basis as societies. 20th century occupational therapy. One of the skeletons of systemic racism hides in our institution's ethical, philosophical foundation of humanism. This may sound rather incredulous, so allow us to briefly unpack this intentionally troubling assertion. Mary Riley's framing, 1961 framing, of the premise of OT, man through the use of his hands as they are energized by mind and will can influence the state of his own health, which continues to resonate with and capture the imagination of OTs all over the world, arguably captures the spirit of humanism that was born by modernity, when humanism emerged during the 17th century Age of Reason and 18th century Enlightenment. From where? Western Europe. We will now reveal the skeleton of systemic racism by employing a long-term historical review in drive-through format. In 1492, Christopher Columbus mistakenly landed in what we know now as the Americas, initiating the conquest of this continent. The white male Christian Europeans had unexpectedly encountered people who they ended up naming Indians because they erroneously thought they had landed in the Indies. This discovery posed a serious dilemma that took 60 years to be resolved during the 1552 Valladolid debate in Spain. Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a Spanish Renaissance humanist, theologian, and proponent of colonial slavery, and Bartolomé de las Casas, a landowner, friar, priest, and bishop, in order to determine whether the Indians could be enslaved. The question whether they possessed a... It was decided that they did, but that this population needed to be saved, Christianized, but they were until today never treated as equal human beings. They referred to this as religious racism, the predecessor to color racism that subsequently enabled a 3 centuries Europeans-run Atlantic captive trade between Africa and the Americas. During the Progressive Era and at 19th, early 20th century, the founding of OT coincided with the emergence of the eugenics movement, which advanced scientific or biological racism, the pseudoscientific belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racism, racial inferiority, superiority. In 1948, while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified by most, but not all, member nations, Article 1 spelled out that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. In South Africa, apartheid laws were enforced by a 10% white minority on a 90% black majority population. In the United States, during the period 1954-1968, the civil rights movement unfolded, and in 2013, Black Lives Matter was founded. These historical snapshots reveal that the civilizing project kicked off by European modernity and humanism was based on the racist premise that being human was and continues to not be a given for all. Therefore, whenever we invoke Mary Riley's man, we are now prompted to interrogate who we have in mind and who we are concerned about. Now that we have briefly identified and addressed one elephant in the room, being human is not a given for all, let us now briefly focus on how racism manifests within our larger world and within our profession. Firstly, racism manifests systemically, which I here metaphorically depict as a large spider web. It reflects what Grossvogel articulated as a capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system, and, if you will, occupational apartheid. Secondly, racism manifests structurally, here presented by the sections of the web that touch, for example, in the context of the United States, infant mortality, incarceration, housing discrimination, government surveillance, immigration policy, employment, wealth gap, drug arrests, and police brutality. Thirdly, racism manifests institutionally, here presented by the threads that run throughout. Examples of key institutions include law, education, healthcare, and the media. This level most directly speaks to us as a profession, for example, considering the demo and geographical political makeup of practitioners, educators, students, researchers, executive team members. In summary, what logically follows acknowledgement of the systemic nature and structural impact of racism is that institutions, including the profession of OT, are also, by implication, racist. This does not make every individual OT racist, but it does call for us to interrogate how, through what we do or are not doing on a daily basis, we may either perpetuate racist or embody anti-racist practices. Before passing on the mic to Elwani to address the how and what questions, we want to share one more angle and explanation of how systemic racism operates in the world at large and thus within our profession, namely the intersectionality of oppressions. Recalling Grossvogel's explanation of racism as a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human, this will now be unpacked a bit more, drawing from the work of Frantz Fanon, the late French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher from the French colony of Martinique. The space above the racialized line of being human depicts the zone of being, and the space below the zone of non-being, portraying a global superiority-inferiority hierarchy and dynamic. In the zone of being, which is linked to whiteness and from where othering is done, the humanity of the people in this zone is recognized. In the zone of non-being, linked to blackness and where one is subjected to othering, the humanity of people in this zone is not recognized or questioned. What is proposed here is that racism is at the core of the intersectionality of oppressions, and classism, patriarchy, sexism, ableism, to name but a few, orbit around it. The dominant way of handling social conflicts in the zone of being manifests materially through regulation and emancipation, and other oppressions are mitigated by racial privilege, whereas in the zone of non-being, conflicts are dominantly responded to through violence and dispossession, and other oppressions are aggravated by racial oppression. This poster offers a disturbing, concrete example of these different materialities of domination. I trust that you get the picture. Lastly, to make the link with occupational therapy and larger public discourses and practices, the notions occupational injustice, occupational rights, occupational deprivation, occupational marginalization were arguably coined in and developed from the zone of being, along with human rights, diversity, equity and inclusion, and cultural competence. Here we suggest that the notions occupational apartheid, occupational consciousness, collective occupation, and epistemologies of the South and decoloniality praxis may resonate more directly with the lived experiences of people in the zone of non-being. We recognize that the contents which we prepared and shared in this Why section are both mentally complex and emotionally taxing. However, confronting and addressing systemic racism is not for the faint at heart, and it inevitably asks us to prepare for appreciating being continuously challenged, because a lot is at stake. Now, over to Ilewana.
Frank has already referred to how institutional racism can easily be perpetuated through everyday doing, even within the practice of OT. In order to avoid falling easily into perpetuating racist practices, honest interrogation of self and what we do every day becomes crucial. In attending to the how question of our presentation, we now turn to occupational consciousness, showing how this term may assist in this honest self-interrogation. Occupational consciousness emerged out of my doctoral study, which focused on intergenerational play. It found that in rural South Africa, Venda in particular, a place where crime at the time of the study was not much of a concern, where children could still play safely outdoors, television and screen time in general had taken over much of family time, with generations spanning children, parents, and grandparents increasingly feeling disconnected and no longer able to share a common and collective narrative about their own play as a family. Even as the older generation bemoaned this state of affairs, held fond memories of children's games no longer seen, sometimes just one generation later, what was striking was the absence in naming television and screen time as having a significant role in disrupting family narratives about play. Parents' own role in securing the prominence of the television within the home was completely missed in their own analysis of what may explain lesser outdoor play and infusing new ways of being that may be characterized as play by the children but frowned upon by adults. One parent, a retired teacher, however, having observed me over a month during fieldwork, turned around one day and said to me, "Erwani, I see what you see." Inquiring further on what he meant, he said, I no longer see myself in my children, and this is only one generation later. We are doomed. And he then broke down in tears. This deep reflection about the impact of rapid social change on family, on society, and how this reflects in what we otherwise deem mundane, children's play, highlighted for me how human occupation, even play, or the ability of family or community to craft its own narrative around play, generation after generation, is deeply political. It is political because it highlights acutely how hegemony, the dominant order, works. How Western modernity imposed on a people brings about disconnection and alienation. Alienation from self, from one's own family, and perhaps one's own society, leading to society in distress, a society doomed. That this happens with very few levers of power to pull for affected society reveals the nature of hegemony and echoes liberation struggles wherever we find an oppressed or colonized people. Both South Africa and the Americas, with a long history of colonization and oppression, cannot escape this. Occupational consciousness is thus grounded in liberation philosophy, with consciousness understood from how it was conceptualized by Biko, Fanon, and de Selle, a mental attitude and a commitment to fight all attempts at subjugation of a whole people on the basis of racialized identity markers. Occupational consciousness therefore becomes an ongoing awareness of the dynamics of hegemony and recognition that dominant practices can be sustained or disrupted through what people do every day, with implications for personal and collective health. Bringing all this back to play, one has to reflect deeply on the value of physical play for growing children. I know both the US and South Africa have many stories to tell about children we see in OT practices, often private practices, children with obesity, with poor postural control and perhaps worse conditions such as diabetes stemming from sedentary lifestyles and easy access to fast foods. It is also easy to blame the parents, but if you look closely at where relatively cheap fast foods can be found, if you listen to the stories of parents to whom the television and screen time are viable alternatives to affordable childcare, you can understand what I'm getting at with regards to the idea of hegemony. I hope you can also appreciate that in coming up with these fast foods and in robbing families and households of parents that can be fully present, instead of availing their labor to prop up the ever-expanding capitalist system, human beings are involved. These human beings, through everyday doing, either perpetuate this hegemony or can begin to disrupt the system. To illustrate this point, when we, as pediatric OTs, attend to individual children as clients, decontextualized from families and societies in distress, we may in fact be perpetuating harmful neoliberal individualism. It goes without saying that such practices must be disrupted. It will take individual OTs to interrogate what they do every day in practice. In attending to the what in our presentation, we now invoke the notion of collective occupation. We defined collective occupations as those occupations that are engaged in by individuals, groups, communities, or societies in everyday contexts, which may reflect an intention towards social cohesion or dysfunction, and or advancement of or aversion of a common good. Collective occupations may have consequences that benefit some populations and not others. A key question to attend to is, to what ends do we occupy and are we occupied? I will, however, focus on the latter for the purposes of today's talk. To what end are we occupied? To do that, we present three case stories, all of which interestingly unfold around educability and the ability to learn or lead in the arena of knowledge production. Perhaps these examples signal how to be seen as having the capacity to learn or to be regarded as knowledgeable as part of collective occupations is fundamental to being human. In the first case story, let me take you back to my early years as an OT, 6 years after the pamphlet fell out of the careers book. My first assignment as a newly graduated young occupational therapist was to establish the first OT department at a school for children with barriers to learning in rural Limpopo, South Africa. A key responsibility that emerged for me in this role was assessing whether applicants to the school were educable or not. This example shows how seeing the human first in context and within their community immediately brings collective occupations to the surface, even if one were to think of OT in the traditional sense. It was also, however, possible to miss this opportunity to do OT differently. On advice from educationalists and psychologists, the school had purchased an aptitude test and had one of the teachers in the past administer this as part of selecting those who could be admitted to the school. The aptitude test was developed from the United Kingdom. Given that this aptitude test was in English and used puzzles, which I knew rural kids would never have seen before, I indicated to the school authorities that the test was not a suitable measure of aptitude for these kids. Although my reservations with the test were understood, the school authorities felt that an alternative test should still be deemed objective. After consulting with other OTs nationally, I was pointed to a newly developed test developed in South Africa and developed specifically for environmentally disadvantaged preschool children. I was still skeptical, given the diversity of South Africa in terms of language, and I was unconvinced about whether at the time, in the 90s, disadvantage was a clearly defined construct that applies across contexts. The school authorities, however, felt this test would be a suitable substitute for the previous one. As an inexperienced OT, I was not about to challenge authority and place myself at risk for insubordination. Given that I was the only OT at the school and was left to work independently most of the time, I decided to use the test only on paper, while in practice, I used other means to determine whether the child was educable or not. Usually these kids with various disabilities, post-polio, osteogenesis imperfecta, cerebral palsy, etc., would present at the school between ages 6 to 9. I used interviews with these children and their caregivers as the most reliable means to assess the children's educability. Two questions proved particularly useful. What is your most favorite song that you dance to at home? Can you share a joke with me that you think is the funniest you have ever heard, or something you saw that you thought was the funniest ever? As backup, I always had a recorded cassette with the latest music trending locally. I would play a song closest to the genre the child had said was their favorite song and begin to dance. Often, I did not even have to invite the child and their caregiver to join in the dance. If the child had rhythm and could sing or hum along, it meant they were fairly educable. The answer to the second question was particularly telling and gave me a good sense about whether the child would benefit from being in the school or not. Once the child was admitted, and I still had a niggly worry that perhaps I'd made a mistake, I would watch the child engaged in unstructured play with others. If they were able to negotiate their own place in a game and know when to lead or follow, I was sold on the child being educable. There are profound implications when we insist on practice that derives from seeing the human in people we work with, humans in context, engaged in collective occupations embedded in context. A child who's deemed uneducable goes back to a community where this diagnosis should make sense. When this is not the case, the community itself may be left with less faith in themselves to identify problems and find workable solutions. The second case story in attending to the what question of our talk is how collective occupation as we defined it becomes relevant even in practices that we ordinarily would not consider to constitute occupational therapy. Curriculum in South African higher education has historically been an arena of struggle characterized by contestations about who deserves university education in a country built upon racialized cheap labor, and who should pay for university degrees otherwise reserved for the elite. Here again, neoliberal individualism finds expression through commodified education, deepening racialized structural inequality. During the student protests of 2015 to 2017 at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, the university curriculum came under the spotlight when students severely criticized the academy's continued and uncritical use of traditional epistemologies, methodologies, and ideologies which reproduced the status quo in ways that are socially unjust, exclusionary, and limiting. The call by Black students and academics to decolonize the curriculum through research and teaching programs became ardent and urgent. Given observable demographic and curriculum transformation in the Department of OT, which I had partly led as HOD, I was called upon to advise the president of the university, or vice chancellor in South African terms, on how to respond to the urgent calls to transform the entire university, and later to serve as co-chair of the university-wide Curriculum Change Working Group, or the CCWG. How the UCT CCWG went about doing its work can rightfully be deemed a collective occupation, with the group seeing its work premised on bringing those who were historically excluded and marginalized, particularly Black students and staff, to the center of the academic project. Students' critique of university curricula during the 2015-2017 Rosemas Fall protests was informed by a decolonial orientation to curriculum, shaped by a rigorous interrogation of knowledge and its relation to society. In attending to this, the CCWG centered its work primarily on 4 questions, prompted by the urgency to develop new ideas to the benefit of society at large. The 4 questions were: what knowledge? Whose knowledge? What or who gets privileged? And lastly, whose interests dominate? In Frank's and my definition of collective occupations, we acknowledge that these occupations may have consequences that benefit some populations and not others. The academic project as a collective occupation, when interrogated with honesty, reveals perpetual unequal relations of power which must be disrupted. In the UCT Curriculum Change Framework, a product of the 2-year-long collective occupation of the CCWG, we invoke occupational consciousness, theorizing around the decoloniality of doing, which becomes an important aspect of an iterative and continuous process of curriculum change in order to avoid a reinscription of colonial epistemic logics. This can also be viewed as disobedient decolonial praxis, a refusal to prop up systemic, structural, and institutional racism which is often embedded in curricula. Decoloniality of doing in this way shifts addressing systemic racism from just being about discourse, but also about performing the academy accompanied by honest interrogation in order to avoid the reinscription of unequal power relations across racialized groups. The third and last example in attending to the what question of our talk builds on the previous case story. It reveals that, of course, there will be consequences to disobedient decolonial praxis. This is exemplified by legal contestation around a university executive position of Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Teaching and Learning. The position was advertised at the University of Cape Town during 2017, seemingly to attract someone who would lead the work of decolonizing curricula. The University Black Academic Caucus, or BAC, nominated me for the position and I applied. However, a white Argentinian woman who was not even an associate professor at the time was instead appointed. At that same time, I was one of only 3 Black African South African female full professors at the entire university, which serves some 30,000 students. And as I had mentioned in the previous example, I had been special advisor to the Vice-Chancellor on transformation, and I was leading the institution-wide work on curriculum change from decolonial perspectives. The resultant court case and ongoing legal process that the UCT Black Academic Caucus launched along with me as a response serves as another act of defiance and disruption, as it is unheard of in the history of the university for any academic, much less a collective, to launch a court case against their employer. Here again, collective occupation as a conceptual lens to understand the Ramugondo and BAC court case becomes useful. That is, if the court case is to be understood as an attempt at building and sustaining human relations based on equity, mutuality, and reciprocity. The appointment of an underqualified white person for a strategic position through which to decolonize the academy demonstrates how structural and institutional racism sustains itself through replicating systems of power and exclusion. It exposes how white people are largely not ready or willing to allow for Black-led change or to cede space to Blacks from excluded and marginalized communities.
We have now come to the end of our talk and will attempt to recapture our main points before Elelani offers the final word. As we, that is, as a gradually diversifying global occupational therapy community, built on the achievements and strengths of 20th century OT, it seems apt to take to heart the following words spoken by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in her 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story. Adichie said, "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity." We envision for 21st century OT to shift to becoming more concerned with and responsive to societies embodying doing well together. This requires recognition of and the cultivation of radical sensibilities regarding our country's historically inflicted harm through perpetuated dehumanization of relationships between racialized groups of people who are to constitute societies together. 21st century OT may then become a praxis of humanizing and healing histories. In other words, living the idea of occupational therapy through Ubuntu. The next slide conceptualizes a visual depiction of what this may look like. For starters, Ubuntu, the African ethic of critical humanism, embodying the premise, "I am because we are," metaphorically making the south the zone of non-being, the peripheries of our global human society and communities, the new north of our ethical political compass. And instead of building OT identities, epistemologies and practices on the 20th century OT relationship between human occupation and health, 21st century OT may adopt being human as occupation and health, not as a given, but as a political potentiality which manifests on a continuum of everyday enacted negations of our humanity and salutogenic affirmations of that which makes us human. The vicious cycle reflects dehumanization and oppressive practices such as systemic racism, and the virtuous cycle, humanization and liberating practices, for example, anti-racism practices. And Elawani is going to have the last word of this presentation.
We close with a simple phrase, which is, we can't be human all by ourselves. And perhaps it is time to synthesize the thesis, Black Lives Matter, and its antithesis, All Lives Matter, into, until Black Lives Matter, there's no all that matters. All would just remain a big, fat lie. We thank you with deep gratitude and humility, and now open the virtual floor for questions, comments, and discussion.
Well, thank you both so much. I've not heard you both speak in tandem, but I've heard both of you speak individually, and I think each time I'm typically left in my own head for so long that it's like hours later that I'm like, oh, this is what I want to discuss. But we will open up the floor for Q&A, and hopefully you've been seeing in the chat there have been a lot of people thanking you for your stories and for this presentation. Excuse me. So we'll give it a minute here as we allow people to add some questions. You're mainly getting lots of thanks, I see. Here we have a question here. There's a question about, could you speak more on the collective occupations, what they are, how we can address them? Oop. We're having trouble with your audio currently.
Let's see.
Oh, there we go.
Does it work now?
Does
Yep.
it work now?
Yes.
Fantastic. I think when thinking and talking about collective occupation, it is important to bring into the conversation the idea of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu, a philosophy and an ethic about being human, which comes from the continent of Africa, but an idea that is shared across many societies. So when I go on and explain what Ubuntu means, many of you would recognize the same idea from your own communities, I hope, especially traditional society. So Ubuntu, as we understand it, in the way that it has been theorized both in the past, but also again and again as people find themselves having to return to that space of needing to think about exactly what it means to be human, they land up over and over again on this idea, Ubuntu. Meaning a process through which we either become more human or less so. This being a process through which we humanize each other basically means that Ubuntu is a responsibility. It is work. So becoming more human is everyone's responsibility. And it is both the individual and the collective that bear that responsibility. So the individual is not in competition with the collective for being human or more human. So if you think about Ubuntu in contrast to individualism, which has been globalized, coming from Western modernity, where the individual surpasses all. Ubuntu makes the idea of individualism completely untenable. So basically saying, when you forget that you did not become that individual all by yourself, you will not know what you need to do to see the human in another. So our idea of collective occupation was to bring this notion of Ubuntu into our understanding as occupational therapists about what people do. Because it is possible that many of us would have bought into this individualism that negates humanity. When you look at the trajectory of societies where individualism became embedded, accompanied by commodification of everything, including health itself. So when, as occupational therapists, we begin to see humans that do, not in a vacuum, but they do in context with others. A simple thing like returning to driving for someone who suffered an injury and ended up with an impairment and perhaps a disability is no longer just about giving back independence to that individual. It is about what driving means for this individual and everyone else whose lives intersect with this individual.
I'm like taking my own notes so that I can come back and reflect on things. Thank you for that. There's speaking to sort of your last slide or your last comment there. Whether or not you are aware over there in South Africa, but in the U.S. we are really struggling with sort of the concepts between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. So could you maybe expand on that a little bit? I think it maybe ties in nicely to what you were just saying.
Okay, I wouldn't mind because you asked me if we would mind, I wouldn't mind to expand a little bit on it. And actually if you allow me, again, to live up to the meaning of my name, to come up with a confession first. That the intended ending, the final part actually of what we had wanted to communicate, one word was left out there. And if you don't mind, I feel called upon to actually say the proper ending, how we had intended to do it. So I first repeat what Ileilani's final thought was there, what she said, right? Which was that perhaps it is time for us to synthesize the thesis, the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter, juxtaposed with the antithesis of no, all lives matter, into until Black Lives Matter, there is no all that matters. And then she ended with, that then would just be a big fat lie. But what Ileilani had intended to say, or what we had intended to communicate, is that all would then just be a big fat white lie. She didn't say it, although it was written. We have shared everything that was written, but except that word didn't come out. And we both said, like, well, maybe there was something else at play here that didn't allow that to be said. But maybe it is, and I think this kind of speaks to the question that you raised now, Brian, a very important question, a sensitive question, of course, is that, I mean, you can see us right now, right? We are black and white behind the screen. It's probably quite historical for a black and white keynote speaker who also happened to be married to actually be presenting in this very year of 2020. Right? So it is maybe true that Ileilani wasn't the one that was actually allowed to say that white word, but I can and do. You get? I think actually it is. I think it is actually quite clear. I think it is actually quite clear that when the response to Black Lives Matter became no, all lives matter, that this was not, that this was experienced as very problematic by those who had founded Black Lives Matter, right? Because really it was a reaction to, if all lives had always mattered, then obviously Black Lives Matter or any other grouping would not have to raise their voices in order to be recognized. So when one then says, no, all lives matter, you're basically immediately perpetuating the very negation of those groups who are not white. You know? And this is something that we as societies, not just in the United States of America, I think the reason why we know so much about you has something to do with the presence, the loud presence of the dominant culture of America all over the globe. You know, we know more about what goes on in the US than what you probably know what is going on in South Africa or in other parts of the world. Right? But still, you know, we make ourselves available. We appreciate the America. I mean, I'm an OT, and probably most of us around the world actually are OTs because it came, occupational therapy, our identity, what we do every day, actually came from the United States. So it is looking at like, well, what is it about the United States that is truly great and important, you know, that one should not lose, that you should not lose, but at the same time not scare away from those very things. Since the origins of the founding of your country, they say, well, until we look at that honestly, you know, and say like, well, actually, until we recognize that there were things that were wrong with us, that still haunt us today, until we recognize it, we can't address it. You know, and that there is a lot of woundedness and wounding that is going on in the United States today. I mean, right now, this year doesn't require you to convince, you don't need to be convinced about that anymore because everybody now knows. So I think this is a time, this year kicks off a new era. There's no doubt about it. It kicks off a new era. It can no longer be ignored. We must face it. And you're not facing it alone as a country. And you're not facing it alone as occupational therapists, of course. Because we're in this together. That's the Ubuntu principle. You know, we cannot be fine if you're not fine, and vice versa. Yeah.
Well, and it made me think, I think, Elawana, you were speaking to when you were talking about the court case, and I'm paraphrasing what you said, but you said it beautifully, that white people aren't ready or willing to cede a platform for Black voices or Black perspectives. And it's sort of that reactivity that you were just talking about, Frank, that it's, oh no, but all lives matter. I think speaking to the new era and needing to do differently, there was a question here. If an OT program in the US was recreating their OT curriculum, loaded question for you, how would you advise taking those first steps to decolonialize the curriculum and to move the discourse forward?
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and one that in the work of the Curriculum Change Working Group at the University of Cape Town, we confronted many times. And it's been very interesting in that in the curriculum change framework, and in the example that I shared regarding that work today, we refer partly to some of the pointers that we give programs who you know indicate very clearly that they do want to give this a go. And so the one aspect to the work that those with the courage to do so take up is to look at the history of the profession. So oftentimes professions and disciplines find themselves stuck and perpetuating the status quo because they have some cultivated amnesia about the birth of their disciplines and professions. I think anthropology is probably one discipline that cannot hide the fact that it served empire, going into colonized spaces and really becoming informants for empire, where indigenous populations were scrutinized and their vulnerabilities known and then exploited in the expansion of colonial capitalism. Psychology has recently become almost next in line, with colleagues within psychology going back to pseudoscience that accompanied colonization all over the world, especially around IQ. How you have very scary narratives of people's skulls being measured and displayed, with psychologists playing a role in making inferences between the size or the circumference of the skull to the size of the brain, and by extension in IQ. So when we go back to occupational therapy's history, where how it was founded, of course there are two distinct narratives, with some who begin around World War One, and others before World War One, and also some who pay attention to when the shift happened, when occupational therapy became of service to the military and or what happens after war, and such that we become constrained in our service, and find ourselves in hospital settings, and in some spaces more and more in the prison industrial complex. Yeah, and we don't step back often and ask ourselves, how did we get here? If we go back to the founding principles of the profession, how true have we stayed close to those founding principles and not get subsumed by the neoliberal capitalist agenda? So that's an important part to start. And then look around at the current situation and ask those 4 questions. What knowledge? Where does occupational therapy draw its knowledge base from? When we talk about human occupation and we give space for students to talk about examples of human occupation, to what extent are those examples coming from the elite? Whom are we leaving out when we allow these examples to become core such that they inform the canon? And then when you think even further around language and the dominance of English, and what gets completely lost to indigenous populations when their own languages are nowhere near what we call the canon in occupational therapy. And then, the whose language or whose knowledge then becomes very clear. The what knowledge and whose knowledge are very tightly linked. Okay? What and who gets privileged, right? And whose interest dominates. It becomes so clear. And students, fortunately for us, are smart. And I think oftentimes we think as educators that we have to start and finish the whole project of decolonizing curricula, when in fact it doesn't have to be like that. When we allow questions to emerge and we see the knowledge project as an evolving one, where we begin to correct, where we begin to interrogate and engage with the skeletons in our cupboards, we make life and the future look a little bit more acceptable. And I've seen young people energized. I've not seen young people overburdened by this project. I've seen young people pick up PhDs that are asking exciting questions. Even at a master's level, we're seeing very engaging work and across races. And that's the beauty of it. Because I think oftentimes people feel, when you go decolonial, it means you're going to leave some people behind. It's not about, inversion and, the inversion of power relations such that the oppressors and the oppressed just swap places. Because that's exactly it. You've got to understand that dominance and ultimate power that subjugates is genocidal. It's genocidal. And we don't want to sign up for that.
Yeah. I love the concept. I wrote it down as a quote. Consider the knowledge project as an evolving one. That it's creating the dialogue and opening it up more and more.
It's expansion. not closure.
Right. We have a few more questions, and I apologize for those who have entered them if we don't get to everyone's, but do you have any advice for those who work in settings that have deep and systematic discriminatory practices or agencies that aren't willing to change?
Yeah. You know, when you work alone in institutions that are brutal, it can become
Kill you.
You can't start really, and I think oftentimes it might just be easier to say, maybe I need to take my contribution elsewhere. But it is important to start asking questions. Um, don't sit with the questions that bother you. Um, and if you can find a community of people who at least are woken up by the questions that you're asking, um, then there's something you can do together. I referred to the UCT Black Academic Caucus. I mean, Frank and I, in our work, um, we've got communities that we go to and engage and find strength in. The Black Academic Caucus at the University of Cape Town really came up from asking questions. When you say, have you seen this? Has this happened to you? Do you see what I see? Because otherwise, if you don't ask these questions or, find others who are seeing what you see, you turn the brutal the brutal weaponry of the institutions upon yourself. It's quite difficult and quite scary when you begin to even doubt your own sanity. And it happens in these spaces where you really think perhaps you've done something wrong, perhaps you deserve it, perhaps there's something wrong with you. But when you begin to have others who affirm you, validate your experiences, it's a community. And when we started responding to many of the issues that are purely about institutional racism at the University of Cape Town, there were very few of us. In fact, the first article that we wrote and got published in public media was written by 13 of us. 13 individuals. And really just engaging the public about what we were seeing. And from there, it has never stopped. So, when you name things as they are, in the way they affect real people, justice follows. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might not even be in your lifetime. And for me, having Frank as a life partner, I know for sure that if I couldn't come home and engage in a way that I get affirmed as a Black woman, I wouldn't have been able to do this work. So the space at home where you have someone who isn't feeding into the violence that you suffer in your work space also helps immensely.
Thank you. I'm going to read this one just so that I capture it correctly. Dr. Kronenberg mentioned that he feels the US is operating more like during apartheid times, when compared to South Africa. Did you mean that in terms of us being brutally honest with ourselves, or can you clarify or elaborate on that?
Sure, sure. No, that's I was being brutally honest by spelling out what has been on my mind and what I've shared at other platforms for many years actually, because I've had the privilege of going to the United States since the first time 1986, and almost there's not been a single year that I did not visit the US either for work or for meeting very good friends. So I have quite a good understanding and feel of the United States and also how it has been changing over the past 30 years. And in recent times, obviously 2001, since 9/11 happened, of course, that was like a big hit to what was going on in the US. So divisions had become stronger within the country, how I perceived it and experienced it. But it has gone beyond that. You know, now in 2020, it's another league and another level altogether. So when I was saying that what we may not be prepared to admit to, both in the US and maybe in South Africa as well, that what is often thought about as having been something that was isolated to one particular country, South Africa, 1948 until 1994, apartheid. You know, apartheid meaning apart as in separate. You know, 90% black population controlled by, subjugated by 10% white population. Formalized in laws, right? Jim Crow-like, but at a more advanced level, you could almost say, for 36 years. You know, everybody kind of in the world knows that story and knows like, yes, that was South African apartheid. But actually, if you look at what apartheid really did, the impact that it had on people and how it operated and where it comes from, so if you historicize it, both the US from its beginnings and South Africa from its beginnings, you know, including the colonial history, then you can start connecting the dots. You see patterns. And I think that's where it becomes very, very important that if we talk about racism, that we actually recognize the systemic nature of racism and origins of it. You know, so when we just speak about it as these are fights about interpersonal prejudice and interpersonal bias that we can address by just kind of saying, let's all respect each other, let's all get along, that's not going to do anything to the structural issues and the structural origins. So it is important that whenever we do speak about it, that we create a space where we allow people to first say, well, actually, when you use this word, what exactly do you mean by it? Define it to the best of your abilities. That's why we consistently says our preferred definition, recognizing that there exist many different ones, just as there exist many different definitions for occupational therapy and human occupation and health, to say like, well, this is how we understand it. You know, and then you get to see how certain patterns of superiority, inferiority, of dehumanization that have been in existence since the beginnings of modernity, of Europeans leaving that continent to go and explore and conquer. This is the language that is used and often celebrated. Hence all these statues, right? Mm. It's only now, almost bit by bit, that we are now starting to say, well, hang on, something ain't right, you know? Columbus Day, celebrated all over the US. And now some cities actually recognizing, actually that's quite embarrassing that we've been celebrating it for so long, that we've been so ignorant of the actual history and the origins of that name, that now it's turned into Indigenous Peoples Days. Right? In several cities around the US, that is already the case. So it is not about literally comparing. That's not what I was saying, that South African apartheid is exactly the same as systemic racism in the US, but it is looking like, well, what are the patterns? You know, what are the key features of it? How did it start? How did it evolve? And how does it manifest? I think that has been our intent with our talk, to kind of try to be as precise as possible without claiming to be experts, to say like, well, these are patterns, you know. And if you look through these lenses that we shared today, and you look around, doesn't matter, it could be within your own family, where you can see certain patterns and they help to not individualize, fall in the trap of individualizing racism. Because I think that's where the deep discomfort comes from. That is not helpful. that just feeds the polemics and pitches each and every one of us against each other, competing for life space and for recognition. That's a trap. That's that same trap of individualism that Dilawani referred to in her examples. You know, yes, we did say it, you know, for the record, because it's never been said before, and none of the position statements that have come out this year have said it. Occupational therapy is a racist. The profession of OT is racist. I'm saying it again now, right? The institution is racist. If you recognize that racism is systemic and has structural impacts and is actually manifest through institutions, then obviously OT cannot say like, well, no, we're not part of all of that. We're not living in that world. Yes, we do. But it is not to confuse it with, and I mentioned that each and every OT therefore is racist. No. But recognizing, understanding the systemic nature and how institutions are embedded in that system just allows us to start interrogating, not investigating, not just exploring. Interrogating means going deeper and going to where it will be uncomfortable and it will be disruptive and you're going to lose sleep over it, and maybe some of us will need to go and seek therapy or whatever it is that we need to do. But there is no running away from it, because if we look around, all around the world, conflicts are escalating. You know, so it's blowing up in our faces all over the place. So it's not even, we don't know whether it's too late to do anything about it. But I think what we can say this year is to start at least recognizing and be honest with ourselves and say, like, well, yes, all kinds of achievements, 100 years of OT, recognize those, celebrate those, build on them. But to also say, like, but you know, where did we lose the plot? And can we get things back on track again there? Yeah? And then to not just rely on the United States of America, that community that OT pretty much comes from globally, but to now recognize that because you guys started something, people all over the world now have actually said, like, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense to us as well. We're going to build that in our countries as well. You have a much larger, much more diverse community to draw from, to actually help you, assist you in addressing this beast, because it is a beast, systemic racism. It is a beast. You know, we, as so many times, the debates, I didn't want to go there, but the presidential debates that you've had, right? And we're both parts of the aisle, of the partisan aisle, you know, they're so pitched against each other, but at least with this debate, people from both sides said, we're better than that. The embarrassment of it for everybody. They says, like, no, how deep can we sink? We have to tap deeper into the humanity here. Because we all have it, but we all can lose it as well. You know, and I think we need language. What we intended to do today as well is to give language, different language, because if you don't have the language to identify and to describe and to explain what it is that we are experiencing, what we are going through, of course, it also becomes very difficult to do something about it. So the language of 20th century OT, as we try to frame it, can serve certain purposes and address certain issues, but for these bigger issues, more complex issues, we need other language, so that we can start talking about it and identifying it, and in ways that are also more precise. You know, and we will come together. It is not all doom and gloom. It never was in the US either. But there is a dominant culture in every country around the world, so it's globalized, that is problematic. But within the United States of America, there's such diversity and there's so many different communities. Ubuntu, although the word may not be used, but the United States and many other countries would have stopped existing if those other communities would not exist, because people are living that. People know that they cannot do without each other. My mom never went high school is the highest degree that she's gotten, but she kind of socialized it into us. She says, humans, it's her language, I translate it from Dutch to English now. Humans cannot do without each other. She had a profound, deep understanding of that. So that kind of taught me to say, like, well, so human occupation cannot be meaningfully understood and applied as a concept if it's not understood as radically relational. Human occupation health, that thing, that premise that our profession is based on, is radically relational. Being human is radically relational. You cannot be human by yourself. and it doesn't go against individual interests. It doesn't. That's another trap. They just don't want us to recognize that together we are stronger. We're only allowed to use it as a slogan, but we must not embody it, because then, then there's trouble. Then dominant interests get worried.
Well, I shared at the end of your presentation that my mind is a flurry, which is a good thing, but I feel like I could probably take up all of your time. I also feel like sort of ending on this note is sort of perfect, and I want to thank you both for your time. I know you're both very busy, and your wisdom, and for sharing the concept of Ubuntu and sort of modeling it. I think, showing us that as a collective, even halfway across the country, if we come together as this sort of global community, we can be more human, we can be more connected, we can be a better collective. So thank you both so much. This has been awesome. I have like goosebumps. And I hope that we can continue to have our international relationship and be this global community. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being with us. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And have a great last third day at the conference.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
it's been great so far.
Yeah.
Also, if you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to look at the chat. I don't know if you've seen some of the comments. I haven't been able to keep up with them. There's like...
They're 99.
Yeah, there's a lot. I've been trying to read them, but I think you've inspired a lot of people. So I would encourage you to read them, because I think it'll be very affirming that your message has been received and has connected with people. So please.
Thank you, Brian.
We'll sort of stay here so you can scroll through for a little bit, not end the session too quickly.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, no, Frank found a way to copy and paste.
Okay, I think we can also save it. It does,
Okay.
and like send it to you. The transcript does come up a little. It's a little funky, at least in my experience. But
yeah, Shannon has indicated that they will save. Yeah.
Okay.
She's asked me that we save the chat. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Shannon.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone. Wow, Bryant, thank you.
Thank you. This was awesome. I know we're twins from around the world. Yeah, and I loved what you were saying there at the end, Frank, in terms of our profession being racist, because we were born in a system that was systemically racist, and it made me think of what Elawani, what you said about and I have so many quotes of yours, cultivated amnesia about the birth of our profession. And it's, even your example of Columbus Day, we, for many of us, how we were educated was, that Columbus was this great explorer and he found the US, and exactly. Yeah.
Educated, right?
Well, I mean, that's how, yes.
Curriculum.
But as a young child, you don't know to question that or to challenge that.
And they know that, right?
Yeah.
They know that, if you can get to young people and teach them a history, even if it's false, because, the education system legitimizes knowledge through text on paper, through curriculum. They know how effective that will be. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but luckily, what I found, people are very good at unlearning rubbish.
Quickly,
They're very quick.
especially
And
when you give permission.
oh my goodness, it goes into the rubbish bin very quickly. And you know, with young people, we have to be very careful and cautious because they get angry, and you know, for having been miseducated, and 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 we have to find a way to channel, you know, to help them channel that anger constructively. And when I see young people come back to do higher degrees, you know, masters and PhDs, I'm like, yay. Yay, because some of these young people could easily have been the ones to burn tires, you know, as part of protests. And they'll tell you, and it's cathartic when you burn something. And you can't blame them. Yeah, and you know, to be complicit in a system that continues with the lies, it's just no longer tenable. Yeah.
Yeah. There's, I think there's a lot of unlearning to do and relearning.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
The relearning the work of humanizing is
At the
there.
core. It's at the
It's
core.
there.
It's at the core.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's there.